進行じゃん。
Okay. Hi. Thank you for gathering today's event. Where we have here a special guest, Dete. Hey.
Hello, everyone. はじめまして。私は35年前、ジャパンで、日本でホームステイをしました。本当を覚えました。そう、英語でいいですか？はい、ありがとう。Well, hello everyone. Thank you very much for coming. I am Dete Shirley. I am the CTO of Dapper Labs. I am the chief architect of the Flow blockchain. You may also know me from having been a founding member of the CryptoKitties team. I also wrote the first draft of ERC 721, and which introduced the term NFT to everybody. And so I've been in crypto since, well, professionally since 2017, and as a hobbyist back with Bitcoin back in 2011. Yeah, today we're going to talk about Flow. So Flow is the blockchain we built because Ethereum broke. We built CryptoKitties. CryptoKitties was more successful than we could have ever imagined. But in a weird way, it was less successful than we hoped because the blockchain was filled, and we had only about 10,000 users any given day, and that was enough to completely saturate the blockchain. And so when CryptoKitties was successful, investors called us, companies called us, and they said, "Hey, can you make Jurassic Park NFTs? Can you make, Warner Brothers NFTs?" And my business partners were all very excited, and they would come to me and they'd say, "We're going to do Jurassic Park NFTs," and I'd say, "No, we're not, because we used kitties and we already overloaded the network. We need a different network." And they said, "Okay, you should go find another network." And so I said, "Okay, I'm going to go find another network." So I took 3 engineers and a product manager named Blaine, and we decided that we were going to look at all the blockchains. And I think between the 5 of us, we probably read about 100 white papers. We talked to about 20 different teams that were proposing and building blockchains. And it took us about 3 months. And at the end of the 3 months, I sat down with all of my engineers and I said, "I don't like any of these. Here we are, we're creating a new company. We are going to make deals with a company like NBA, and we're going to try and sell NFTs to millions of people, and I don't want to bet my company on any of these blockchains." And so, well, what do you do in that case? Well, the good news is, we had just read 100 white papers. And so we knew, we between the 5 of us, we had all of the smartest ideas in blockchain all fresh in our mind. And so I said to the engineers, I said, "We're going to take 2 weeks, and we're going to see if somehow we can come up with some different idea that would change how a blockchain is structured so that we can have the scale that we need, but it's going to let us build the applications that we want." And a week later, we came up with a really fundamental idea, which was saying, look, the way every blockchain works today is that they form consensus and they run the transactions on the same computer at the same time. what if we can split that apart? Because consensus is inherently the part that you need to be decentralized. You want as many people participating in consensus as possible to maximize the security, the integrity of the blockchain. But if everybody is doing every computation, then you have everybody's computer is very busy, it's very wasteful, it's never going to be cheap, it's never going to be high throughput. But we realized if we could separate those two things and have different computers running the transactions and have that separate from the computers that were building in the consensus system, that we could scale to tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of transactions per second, maybe even 1 million transactions per second. So we went to all of our investors, some really great investors, Union Square Ventures, Fred Wilson, Chris Dixon from Andreessen Horowitz. We were talking to CoinFund at that time, and we said to them, hey, remember how we said we were going to build these amazing applications, consumer applications? Well, we don't like any of the blockchains out there, so we're going to build our own blockchain. And they said, you're crazy. They said, there's all sorts of researchers building blockchains out there. You should do what you're good at. You should build applications. No one else knows how to build applications the way you do, but somebody else is going to solve this blockchain problem. And so I sat down with all of their technical team members and I said, look, this is why we think the way we want to build a blockchain will be different than what other people are doing. And some of them understood relatively quickly, or maybe they just had some faith, but other of them were really difficult to persuade. But in the end, we convinced them that we had an idea that was fundamentally new and different that no one else was doing, and that we had the technical capability to execute on that. And so starting in 2019, we started building the project that would become Flow. At that time, it had the code name Bamboo, actually. Something that grows very fast. And so, at the same time, we had signed this deal with NBA, and we had working with NBA, designing what would become NBA Top Shot. But NBA assumed that this was all going to run on Ethereum. And so one day we went to NBA and we said, hey, we got this idea for a new blockchain. And they're like, yeah, but Ethereum, right? And we're like, well, maybe, right? Like, we can still do Ethereum, but maybe you want to look at this new blockchain. And so eventually, after talking to NBA a lot of times, and I assume the NBA talks to some of our investors as well, and we convinced them that actually NBA and Flow can launch at the same time and be the first application so that people can see what Flow can do. And so, yeah, in 2020, we launched Top Shot and we launched Flow, and the Flow blockchain is now running. So, how many here? Well, hopefully everyone here has heard of Flow. How many here understand why Flow is different? Like what things about Flow are different than other blockchains? Does anyone have any strong ideas about that? Over here, yeah. Over here, yeah. Oh, look at this guy back there. He's got a big hand. So let me talk about the sort of. So what I just said there was why, right? Why did we think we should build a new blockchain? But once we started building a new blockchain, we asked ourselves, well, should we just copy everything else that these other teams are doing too, or should we ask whether or not there's a better way? And there were two big areas, right? So in addition to our separation of consensus and compute, there were two other areas where we really wanted to make a big change. And the first one was what we call the account model. So our account model was very different from the account model that is in Ethereum and that most blockchains sort of copy. And in fact, the account model we came up with looks very much like what is now called account abstraction. So the whole notion of account abstraction is not that your account is attached to a key. It's that your account has maybe a key, but it also can have code that controls it. And if you let the code decide what transactions are allowed to be run, you can do many interesting and powerful things, right? You can have multiple keys for one account. This is very helpful if you have more than one computer. Who here has more than one computer? Count your phone, right? So why should I have Why should I copy my private keys or my key phrase from one device to another, which is inherently insecure? Why don't I just have one account, and I generate a key on my phone, I generate a key on my laptop, and I attach both of those keys to one account. Now I can share the account, but I don't have to move those private keys off of those devices. Even better, now I can use the hardware enclave. So everyone knows their phone has, the thumbprint or the face scanning. We have the secure enclave. Those are hardware devices that no one knows how to pull the keys out of them. They're very, very secure. Even military doesn't know how to get the keys out of those devices. You can't use that when you need to copy your key to another device in order to use the account, right? But if you have an ability to add keys to your account, then you can start to use them. So that's another advantage of the account model. So that account model was a big differentiator, and critically, that made for a much better user experience and much more powerful programming model for software developers to take advantage of. The other big difference that we made was we decided to make a bet and build a new programming language. And that programming language is called KBs. That is, to this day, the scariest decision I've made in my professional career. Because everyone knows Solidity, everyone understands EVM. It's terrible. Anyone who's written Solidity hates it with a passion. But they know how to make it work. And there's a lot of code out there that does make it work. But the team at Dapper Labs we built CryptoKitties, which is a relatively complex product. But we also did a project called Cheese Wizards, and not many people know about Cheese Wizards. Does anyone know about Cheese Wizards? Anyone here heard about Cheese Wizards? Yeah, we got a couple. Oh, great, I love that. So Cheese Wizards was a game, an entirely on-chain game, where you go and you buy these little wizards. They were very cute, and they were made of cheese, and they would have power imbued in them. And it was a battle royale, where your wizard would enter into a tournament with all the other wizards, and then my wizard could battle your wizard. And when they battled, we would play a rock, paper, scissors game. And whoever won would drain the power from the other wizard. And all of that logic, the rock, paper, scissors, the power, all of that was written in Solidity, so that it was a fully trustless game where you could, I think if anyone's looked at blockchain gaming today, most blockchain games, it's like, well, yeah, there's an NFT on the blockchain, but the game is just running on somebody's server. But this was a game that run entirely on the blockchain. And that, writing those smart contracts for that rock, paper, scissors tournament just about killed me. It was me and two other engineers. Three other engineers, but only two at a time. One of them left halfway through the project and another one joined us. So it was me and two other engineers, and we worked for 2.5 months, maybe 3 months, just to build a rock, paper, scissors game. And we paid for 2 separate audits, and when we launched it, it still had bugs. And one of the bugs was so bad that we realized that soon after we launched, we actually shut the tournament down and launched a whole new tournament, like a separate set of smart contracts, and basically refunded everybody their power so that they could play again. And that second version also had bugs in it. And that experience, it just, there's a discord in my mind. How can we say that the blockchain is the future and that all of these amazing applications are going to come? We're going to disrupt insurance. We're going to disrupt real estate. We're going to disrupt social media. But when you actually try and build something that is as complex as rock, paper, scissors, I don't know, maybe we're dumb engineers, but I don't think so, right? I think we're pretty smart. I think we tried pretty hard. I think we used pretty good auditors. And yet, it's something that difficult. It was 3 separate smart contracts, and one of those smart contracts, they actually had to go into the smart contract and remove error messages because we were running up the limits of the size of the smart contract on the area. And so when we were asking ourselves, well, what should we do? What sort of runtime should we have in the blockchain? I just said, I don't want to be EVM. Like, we've got to do something else. And so the obvious answer at that time was WASM, eWASM. The Ethereum community seemed really committed to the idea of moving to WASM. And of course, I think most folks here know that Solana ended up using WASM. And I think it was a couple other blockchains. And so I took one of my engineers. It's funny, we hired him to be an iOS developer. But it turns out he had a master's degree in computer languages. But it's hard to get work in computer languages. So I pulled him, I'm like, great, you know computer languages. Go to the WASM conference, right? Talk to everyone there, come back and tell me how WASM is going to solve all of our problems. And he came back and he said, WASM is terrible for this. It is the wrong solution for this problem. It's designed for the wrong security model, right? The security model of WASM is, I have a computer that is got lots of private data in it, it's got maybe my credit card numbers and stuff like that. And I'm downloading code from the internet, and I need to run that code separate from what's happening in the rest of that computer, and be fully secure against that. So that's good for blockchain, right? Like if you're running a blockchain node, you don't want the software, the smart contract software to get access to the rest of it. So that's good. But the other thing that you want in blockchain is that one smart contract can't reach into another smart contract and change its data. But WASM has no controls inside the virtual machine as to what data, what code is allowed to touch what data. So one option is that you have a different WASM instance for every smart contract. But again, imagine if you have a complex application. Imagine if you have 5, 10 contracts all talking to each other in one transaction. You're going to run 5 or 10 VMs, WASM VMs, just so you have enough security? That's terrible. The other thing that is absolutely critical in blockchains is that all execution has to be fully deterministic. It has to be exactly the same bits when it's run on every single machine. And WASM didn't have that ability. Now, the whole point of eWASM, and the reason why the eWASM was built, was to try and solve that problem. But when we were making this decision, that problem hadn't been solved. The people who designed WASM, right, the people at Google and Apple who were collaborating to make WASM, they said, that's a terrible idea. You shouldn't do that because we're just going to break it one day. Because we're trying to solve our problem, which is how do you make code run really fast in a browser? And I guess you can fork it, but one day what you're calling WASM isn't going to be what we're calling WASM. And then all of the compilers and stuff that target WASM, they're either going to have to support both variants, or more likely, your variant is just going to get left behind. So WASM seemed like going the wrong way. The other thing about WASM, actually, which is very interesting, if you go look at blockchains that use Rust, Cosmos and Solana are the two that I've looked at, what you see is that their smart contracts are somewhere between 2 and 5 times bigger than the equivalent Solidity smart contracts, because those languages were never designed to manage secure ledgers, to track ownership, to track access control. They were designed to keep track of memory, network connections, file systems, right? We don't have any of those things exposed to smart contracts directly. Imagine if a smart contract could open up an HTTP port, right? It sounds cool, but it doesn't allow for deterministic execution. And so again, it was the wrong tool being used to solve this problem. And so we were talking to one of our advisors, and I said, man, I don't know what to do. Like, WASM seems like the wrong solution. Rust doesn't seem like it's a great language to write smart contracts in. The EVM is a garbage for it. He's like, write your own language. I'm like, what? He's like, come on, it can't be that hard. He's like, you're building a blockchain. Surely a language isn't as hard as that. Well, it is hard. But fortunately, who did I have to work with? I had, this coworker named Bastian, Bastian actually hadn't done much smart contract development before, and so he and I worked together to design Cadence. So I would come to him and I would say, I want to work with a smart contract that looks like this, and I would write a bunch of code in a made-up language. And then I would send him these files and I'd say, okay, write an interpreter for this. And he would look at it and he'd say, Dieter, I can't, because this is ambiguous. This doesn't make any sense. You're using this syntax here to mean one thing, and down here it means something else. And we went back and forth like that until we came up with something that felt cool to use, but which worked. So I tried to make it feel good. He tried to make it work. So between the two of us, we came up with Cadence. Now, has anyone here written Cadence? Yeah? Is it any good? Have you written Solidity?
Yeah.
Which is better?
I definitely Cadence.
Definitely Cadence.
Yeah.
Maybe ask him later when I'm not listening.
Because I'm iOS engineer.
Oh yeah.
So I'm more familiar with Swift.
Right.
They just like.
Yeah, no, and Bastian, it was an iOS developer and was a big fan of Swift, and of course, you can see that in Cadence. So, Cadence is very powerful because it actually builds into the language this notion of what we call resources. And resources are objects. If you're familiar with object-oriented programming, it's actually derived from object-oriented programming. And these resources are objects that are also linear types, which means they can only be in one place at one time. So normally in a data structure in a programming language, it's easy to make copies of them, right? So if I have the number 5 and I call a function and I pass the 5 into the function, well, I still have a 5, right? Like I still have that variable in my scope, and then the function has a copy of it. Linear types were actually created in Rust to solve the memory management problem and figure out, make sure that only one code scope had access to allocated memory at a time. But it turns out that, and in fact, even when we talk about systems programming, when we talk about whose job it is to free memory, we usually say who owns that memory, right? So this data structure is owned by this code. And so this data structure will be freed up by that code. But that notion of ownership, that only one thing, like that's what so much of smart contracts are about, is ownership, who owns this thing. And so by creating these linear types that had objects and semantics, we could create an object that you could pass as an argument to a function, but when you passed it into the function, you didn't have it anymore. And so suddenly, instead of money being referenced in some like table that you look up, money is like cash. When you call a function in Cadence and you pass money into the function, that money goes into the function. It is. I don't know how to explain it any better than that. It literally goes in. And so you can write a function in Cadence that takes money as an input and returns an NFT as an output, and that's how marketplaces work. And so that has the awesome side effect that your stuff, right, all of the tokens you own, all the non-fungible tokens you own, they actually get stored in your account. Weird side effect of the way Solidity is structured is if you want to know what you own, you have to go to every smart contract on the entire blockchain and see if your address is in the ledger that it maintains. In Flow, if you want to know what you own, you look in your account and you see what you own. And it's just such a much more natural way to think about it, and it's a much more powerful way to give people the tools to control their own stuff. So, yeah, I don't know what else to say. Those are the major differences that Flow has. I think that the fact that it's different is difficult, right? There's a team over here who, Settlement, is that right, your team? Yeah. So they build an abstraction that lets people talk to various blockchains. They're going to hate building for Flow, at least to start, because they've built tools for, I don't know how many other chains, maybe 5.
Mostly EVMs and
Exactly. Right? So for them, it's actually going to be frustrating, because although the Cadence data model is superior if that's what you're focused on, they're going to have to try and make those things work together. Now, you can make it work. We worked with Coinbase to implement Rosetta, which is a similar sort of abstraction. And so, it can work, but it does make it a little bit more difficult for people who are, trying to sort of abstract the differences away between blockchains. But I think one of the things that, years of software development has taught me is that the best software is always the software that is designed for the environment in which it's deployed. And it's useful in certain cases to have abstractions if you're somebody like Coinbase, right? And all you care about is just moving tokens around. It's okay. You don't want to. You can hide the features, the enhancements of some of those chains because you're only interested in the sort of this lowest common denominator functionality. But my hope is that by giving additional tools to developers who are building on Flow, that someday someone will come along and build something more complex than rock, paper, scissors. And that in that future, when we have that more complex software running on a blockchain, that we'll be able to create something that even more people can get excited about. I think that the financial primitives of DeFi and whatnot, I think that's awesome. I'm glad that those things exist. I think NFTs are awesome, and I'm glad that collectibles exist. But I think that that's just the first step down the road of what blockchain can achieve. And if we were to go and look 5 years, even 10 years into after the creation of the internet and say, that's it. This is all we need, right? There's not going to be any more interesting software than Telnet, email, and FTP. We would have left out the whole web revolution. And I think that blockchain is going to have that moment. And I think the more powerful tools we can give developers, the more likely that moment is to come, the sooner that moment is to come. And I want to see that moment, and so that's why we made Flow. This is more or less all I have to say at this point, but I would love to take any questions that people might have. You promised me you'd have a question. Oh, there he is. I talked to him before. He claimed he'd have a question, so it wouldn't be silent, and then just let it be silent.
Thank you very much, Dete,
Yeah, for sure.
explaining their flow, and that is pretty awesome. It's very wanted to talk with you. And my question is that is this perspective, what's going to be the tipping point for the NFT that everyone's going to NFT, like the grandma, grandpa, my father, and my mother's going to NFT. So what's your perspective for the generalization of the NFT?
I mean, the short answer is utility. But I think the real answer is going to obviously be much more nuanced than just that. So when the answer comes, and your aunt owns an NFT, the reason she owns the NFT, it'll be easy to look at that and say that's utility. 5 years ago, when my aunt didn't want to buy an NFT, that utility was missing. But what is that utility? For your aunt, I don't know, right? And you can tell me about your aunt, and maybe we can solve it together. But there's lots of people talking about lots of ideas. I think some of the most obvious ones is just having that NFT mean something in real world, right? We work with Ticketmaster. Ticketmaster works on Flow, and they're not yet using the NFTs as the tickets. But they're issuing the NFTs kind of as receipts or mementos. And one of the things that we want to do in NFL All Day is take people who have actually gone to a game, which we know because they have an NFT from Ticketmaster, and maybe give them access to a special drop. Maybe just give them some NFTs, right? Suddenly that NFT from Ticketmaster has some utility. And it's not just a memento. So that's an interesting one. I mean, that's NFT giving you more NFTs, so maybe that's not going to work for your hand. But I still believe that vision that we were playing with Cheese Wizards, this idea of a game that's fully on chain. Cheese Wizards was very explicitly like a time limited thing. I can't remember, it was about a month, I think, maybe 2 weeks long. I can't remember for sure, but it was specifically a time limited tournament. But you could imagine a game where the logic lives on chain and And as the game evolves, new game pieces are released. And if the game pieces have the logic attached to them, the game actually expands over time. And even better, because it's smart contracts, because it's on this open platform, if it's designed right, if it's designed in an open way, other people could add game pieces to your game. And what's amazing about that is that we stumbled upon that with CryptoKitties, that people wanted to build games that use CryptoKitties. Now, some of those people just love CryptoKitties, right? And they wanted to do stuff in the CryptoKitties environment. But we had one team that built a game for CryptoKitties that hated CryptoKitties. They were people who like, they like the dark aesthetic, cyberpunk, right? They wanted to do like something a little, with more gray and dark blue colors and less pink and purple. But guess where the users were? At that time, everybody knew CryptoKitties. And so they made a game for CryptoKitties because that got their users. Now think about what an amazing win-win-win situation that was, right? Our users, who had already bought into the CryptoKitties ecosystem, got something new to do with their cats. We got somebody else building software that made our ecosystem more valuable, and they were able to tap into an existing audience. And anyone, I don't know if any of you have ever been in gaming or mobile gaming particularly, that's the hardest part of all, is getting an audience. And so if you can tap into an existing community, that's a big deal. And that, if we can get that kind of ecosystem, whoever gets that ecosystem started first it's going to be a juggernaut. Because I think that, I hate to use the example of Roblox, because everyone points to Roblox and you see people in the crypto space trying to ape Roblox and make something that looks like Roblox. But the games that succeeded in the App Store in 2006 when the iPhone was released, they didn't look like Halo, right? Like you have to write the right games for the platform that you're targeting. But that idea of Roblox where one person, one group creates a platform and then other people are coming in and adding on top of it and creating value on top of it is amazing. And if you could build a Roblox-like ecosystem, not the way it looks, not the way it plays, but the way that the users interact with the creators, interact with the platform, and if you made that open, where the platform creator wasn't taking half the money, I think that you could imagine just an incredible, they're just unstoppable, right? Because why would anyone stop using that, right? Like Roblox, you can imagine people stop using Roblox, right? Because the Roblox company could become, even worse. They could decide they want to take even more money, or they could decide to, not to move the technology forward. But if it's a truly open platform, then there's never going to be any reason to leave. You just keep adding more things on it and making it better and better. And I think that sort of thing is just going to be, I think that that's going to be the tipping point moment for blockchain technology generally. And you and I will look at that and say, oh, those are NFTs. I don't even know if the players will think of them as NFTs, right? They might, right? But they won't be NFTs the way that NFTs are today, as this collectible.
Thank you very much.
I think you went first.
Next, big fan. We're all fans here, I think. Not to put you on the spot or anything, but so it's been like what, 3 years, 4 months, 5 years since you went into development, 3 years since it's launched. You guys have made incredible progress. But if you had to go back and change one thing about like deployment, anything, what would that be? So I know that not to put you on the spot, and I mean, it's just like, I'm just curious, but if you had to like maybe change one thing in how you kind of like approached, I guess, your demographic, or, I know that's a business decision in a way.
So, I have an answer for you.
Okay.
And you can tell me whether or not you want to figure out one. The one that comes to mind actually is that I think that, so we built Flow because we wanted a higher scale blockchain that had extra capabilities. And then we built NBA Top Shot as intended to be like a lighthouse and say, hey, everybody, you can come build on this blockchain and you can be successful here because look, we're successful here. And we made two really big mistakes when making Top Shot. One, a typical developer doesn't look at Top Shot and say, I could recreate that. Because guess what? They don't have a license with one of the biggest sports in the world, right? Now, there have been a number of teams that have been able to get licenses and have come, the Indian Premier League for cricket is built on Flow. There's a team that's building on Flow there. And so that's possible. But we could have inspired thousands of people to create their own applications if we had also created something else. I'm not saying we shouldn't have created NBA Top Shot, but I'm saying that by making that one big bet instead of having a couple of maybe smaller things, we didn't show the world that Flow could be used for something else, and Flow could be used for, in particular, be used for something that doesn't require you have one of the hardest to get sports licenses in the world. The other thing is that I said we built Cadence because we wanted to give more capabilities to the suite. I talked about how I think the unlock moment for blockchain is going to come when you have these ecosystems of interoperability, and yet we didn't design those things into Top Shot, right? We talked about them. We're doing some of those things that there are various projects built on top of Top Shot, but people are really nervous to actually build extensions to Top Shot because it's the NBA license, and they know that the NBA can shut them down at any point in time. If it was our own IP, if it had been CryptoKitties again, then people would be like, yeah, well, we're gonna do this crazy stuff. The CryptoKitties people, hopefully they'll like it. But at least they're like crypto people and not the NBA. So I think those two things were things that we didn't inspire people. We showed that you could be successful on Flow, but we didn't inspire people to think that they could be successful on Flow. And I think we really should. That's probably the biggest thing I would change.
Thank you.
Is that acceptable? I felt like you were fishing for something else.
I understand it was a tough time to putting in resources to develop NBA Top Shot. It's a lot of money, right? A lot of resources put into that.
It also made a lot of money.
It was a tough time to raise too. So I know you can't really diversify your resources into smaller things. You're trying to nail a big fish. NBA Top Shot.
Honestly, it was the other way around. The fact that Top Shot was making so much money and investors were so excited in it meant that it was actually hard to get resources on Flow, right? Because you have only so many people at a company, right? I don't know if anyone here is actually trying to hire somebody. It's really hard to find good people. And so you might think, these guys, they have big fundraise, or even somebody like Apple, right? The biggest company in the world, biggest tech company in the world. Surely they can. No, it's really hard for them to hire people, and it's really hard for us to hire people. And so when we have a product going nuts, it's actually hard to get things happening on the blockchain that, especially when some of those things don't pay off for years.
I remember the early queues for the packs.
Right.
And just getting everyone to pack.
Yeah.
Pretty hard. So.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, by all means.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you. So I love Dete so much, and you might say that already that Cadence is eating in Go, and you said in this year that Cadence not to be eating in Go. You said not that. And I want to hear that why Go is so superior than that in Cadence. You might say, but you speaking so quickly. So I want to hear that why Go is superior in making smart contracts.
So I will answer your question, but I maybe misspoke earlier, and I apologize. What I was talking about is using Rust to write smart contracts directly. So both Cosmos and Solana, I'm sure there's other. You write the smart contract in Rust, and you compile that to WASM, and then the WASM is executed on chain. Cadence is a language that is interpreted we happen to have written our interpreter in Go, but you could absolutely write a Cadence implementation in Rust. So the question of Go versus Rust is implementing the blockchain, not using it. So there is no, I'm not aware of anybody using Go as a smart contract programming language. We used Go to implement Flow. We could have used Rust. So then to come to that question, why did we choose Go instead of Rust? That was a big argument. It's a brand new code base. We have a bunch of engineers that we're asking them to build something very complex. And I said, hey guys, let's do it in Rust. And they said, well, we've never used Rust before, but we're all actually quite experienced in Go. And I said, well, I'm a little worried about the performance that we might see out of Go. And they said, yes, but who cares how good our performance is if we can't actually ship, because we don't know how to get Rust to work properly. Or, not that we don't know how to get Rust, like, of course they knew they could learn Rust, right? But they were worried about what, because timelines matter, right? And talking in terms of things, potential regrets. And so, in the end, what we decided as a team was that Go or Rust could be a mistake. Maybe choosing Go is a mistake, and we'll end up with performance problems. Maybe choosing Rust is a mistake, and the team learning how to write Rust, they might spend 6 months writing a bunch of code and go, oh, I get it, and then have to throw everything out because they now have some fundamental understanding of how to make their code better, and then they rewrite it and it's so much better. We just lost 6 months. And so if Rust was a mistake, then the mistake would come before we launched. And so, I think this is probably the best example of that sort of old adage of MVP thinking, always worry about shipping, always, make the next step, don't over plan for the future. If one of those things was a mistake, and which mistake is better, before you launch or after you launch, right? And after you launch is definitely when you want to make the mistake, because then you know whether or not people are interested, right? The only reason Go is even a problem for us now is because people are actually using our blockchain. And when we get hundreds of transactions per second, suddenly Go and its garbage collection starts to be a problem. But guess what? 100 transactions per second, that's 10 Ethereums, right? That's a pretty good position to be in. So, yes, of course we're going to have to optimize it. We may have to replace parts of it in Rust. In fact, we probably will replace parts of it in Rust. But getting something out the door was so important that I'm really glad that we chose Go.
Yeah, so that everyone like Cadence, because Cadence is easy to write. Because it's written in Go. So you chose the Go, and then we love Cadence because it is very easy to write. Yeah, it's not like to draft. Yeah, that's why.
Yeah.
That's why everyone.
There you go.
Yeah.
Very cool. Yes, please.
Thank you for your presentation. Actually, I love Cadence. We already launched the service flow, but in our operation, we have one specific problem. So if you have some good idea, please let me know. Actually, user can purchase NFT, large number of NFT in our service. In some case, single user has over 200 or 300 NFTs in their wallet. But in this case, of course, to have large number of NFT on flow, it requires some of flow balance in their wallet. But they don't wait to get flow normally in Japanese market. Sometimes we need to transfer flow balance to their wallet. So it's really complex operation. So in my understanding, walletless approach, maybe someone already makes an idea about walletless architecture recently. So maybe we can apply this kind of service or architecture to avoid this problem, but is there any other good idea or approach to manage flow balance.
So, just some context to anyone who doesn't know cadence very well. Remember I said that in Flow, all of your stuff is in your account? Well, that gives us an opportunity to make sure that that users are paying for the amount of storage they're using. So this was a discussion that, I don't know why it went away, because it's going to happen again, but there's this whole question of who should pay for storage? How do you pay for storage? So on Ethereum, you pay when you allocate storage. The problem with that is that it creates almost no incentive for people to delete old storage. And because it's the users that are paying as part of their transaction fee, there's no incentive there's very little incentive for the developers to be careful about doing their storage. Weirdly enough, CryptoKitties, you would think CryptoKitties has, there's over 2 million kitties at this point in time. You would think it'd be one of the largest smart contracts in terms of storage use on Ethereum. And it is, it's up there, but there's actually 2 smart contracts that are way bigger than any others. And there are actually 2 ERC20 smart contracts that record in storage every transfer that ever happened. And they were written a long time ago. The developers didn't understand how events worked and how there was already a record of every transfer that ever happened. So there are these 2 smart contracts that just use an extraordinary amount of storage on Ethereum, and that's just always going to be there. And so there's been discussion of this notion of storage rent, where the person who owns the storage pays for it. But if the storage owner is a smart contract, that means that you can never have an autonomous smart contract. There always has to be an owner. Otherwise, eventually, it's going to run out of rent, the ability to pay its own rent. And then who's going to pay the rent? And you have sort of a tragedy of the commons problem where I don't want to pay rent, even though I'm using that smart contract, and I hope somebody else pays rent, right? And then you run into this problem where maybe no one does, and the system breaks. So we now have the opposite problem on Flow, which is that if a user goes and buys a bunch of NFTs, they might fill up their storage. And the way we do storage rent, it's not actually rent in Flow, it's just a minimum balance. So if you have lots of storage, you have to have a larger minimum balance. But it's not uncommon for people on Flow to use USDC or even credit card, of course, to buy NFTs. And so they may not even aware of the notion of having Flow, even though they have to have a minimum balance. And so I don't know what to tell you other than there's no easy answer. We've looked at options of potentially this notion of delegated storage fees, where someone can say, hey, yes, this account needs to have a minimum balance, but you can look at my account instead, and I'll make sure I have a minimum balance to cover them too. The problem is that it's very complex to compute at runtime, because I don't know how big your project is, but if you had 1,000 users, then every time one of those 1,000 users increased their storage, we would have to check all 1,001 accounts to make sure that they didn't add up to more, right? And of course, you can build a system that manages incremental storage and incremental changes and updates the balance, but it's just a lot more bookkeeping. The team has also been looking into the idea that when you create the NFT, you pay for the storage at that point in time. You then run into that problem again that Ethereum has, that, well, where's the incentive to delete objects then? Which, as time goes on, is going to become a big deal, because if we're successful and we really do get 1 billion people to use this blockchain, that's a lot of data. And if everyone is really lax about their data usage, then it's just going to be, we're going to hit the scaling limits. And so we need to figure it out. So there are people at the Flow team who are looking into this, trying to figure out what the right model is there. My best suggestion for you would be to potentially transfer a little bit of Flow in the purchase transaction. So when they come and they buy an NFT, you give just enough Flow to cover that. it's not a great solution because you know, depending on how the encoding is done, it's not always the exact same amount of money. So you're gonna have to round up a little, which means you're kind of leaking money a little. But I think that right now, when the float price is relatively low and the storage price is relatively low, it's probably the easiest solution. We are absolutely looking at that problem, and it's just, unfortunately, we don't see any obvious solution. Every potential solution has 3 or 4 other downsides, different downsides than the previous one. So. Okay, ready.
Thank you for your presentation. I was an enthusiast for CryptoKitties.
Okay.
I remember that. So I'm an R&D developer from Sony Corporation. So every day I think, what can I contribute to Web3 ecosystem? But I little struggle with it. So I want to ask you about that. I think there are tens of thousands of small companies and startups. So, but you know, Sony is some sort of large company. So, what do you think, such as Sony or Google, big company can contribute to Web3 environment? What do you want them to contribute to Web3 environment?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I mean, my experience with larger companies is that it's very rare for them to do something new. And it's, you know, this word innovation, I'm trying to avoid the word innovation because I think it's a word that's overused. But that idea of, like, what big companies are very good at is pushing forward research and development that we know we have a pretty good idea that it's possible. It's just hard to get there, right? So just the first example that comes to my mind is like batteries, right? Like better batteries. Better batteries is always going to be a very expensive proposition. It involves hardware, it involves chemistry, it involves dangerous chemicals. And yes, there are startups that are, you know, working in this area, but usually they almost always have a partner, like a big company partner. And that's exactly where big companies do really great work, in that sort of scenario where it's like, we kind of all know where we want to get to, and it's a lot of work to get there, and ergo it's a lot of money to get there. But we all understand the value of getting there. That's a really valuable place for larger companies to engage in. What we need in blockchain right now, though, is pretty different, which is we don't know where we're going, right? And it's kind of a scary mission for me to make some days, but the analogy I always use is, imagine we were sitting in the audience when Steve Jobs first held up the iPhone, and you know, you and I are sitting there, and I lean over to you and I'm like, man, this is going to change the way people move around cities. You would say, what? What do you mean, right? Now, I know Uber isn't very big in Japan, but certainly it's completely transformed the way that transportation works in North America. And Uber can't exist, Lyft can't exist without you having a GPS-enabled internet computer in your pocket at all times. So what does a decentralized computer allow us to do? Well, we know some things, right? We know that it allows us to create sort of a more democratized form of finance with all of the positive and negatives that come with that. We know that it allows us to create new ownership types, meaningful ownership in terms of digital ownership, right? Like, we've all been very comfortable with the idea of digital ownership in games for a very long time, except it's not digital ownership, because all of that ownership is tracked on the computer of the company who made that software, and they can shut that down at any time. And the idea that you can own something and the company that made it can go away like that's always existed in the physical world, right? Like if you go and buy a Monopoly game and Warner Brothers shut down tomorrow, guess what? You can still play Monopoly the next day, right? But that's not true of any online games. But it's true. It can be true with blockchain games. And so I think what we need most from Sony is to be open to the opportunity to work together. I haven't worked with Sony much, but obviously Apple is somebody that we talk to because we want to get mobile apps out in the world so that people can use their NFTs and blockchain technology through mobile apps. But Apple, for a long time, they only saw blockchain through the lens of financial speculation. And they're like, look, we don't want to play that game. We don't want to have a bunch of financial speculation stuff on our app store. This is called Robinhood, of course, but so they were really resistant. And there used to be a rule actually in the App Store, an unwritten rule that anything you couldn't have CryptoKitties anywhere in your stuff. I don't know. It's kind of funny to me because I used to work for Apple, and when I was younger, when Apple was like the not cool company, like back in the 90s when they were almost dead, I was a huge Apple fan. I was the biggest Apple fan in the world. And so to be banned by Apple was kind of something interesting. But anyway, but they're changing their mind. They're opening up their App Store to the idea of NFTs now. And that's more what we need from these companies, is not necessarily for them to push us forward, but just to make sure they don't keep us back. Because once we show what this stuff can do, if we're given enough space to demonstrate what we think it can do, yeah, some of it'll not work, or it'll cause problems, and we'll want to get those things cleaned up and go away. But I mean, every new technology has had, it creates potential, and if we allow that potential to blossom, that's when we find the new use cases. And then, of course, these big companies can come in and use this, right? There's no way in the world that when we could, back when I originally wrote ERC 721, imagine if I went to Ticketmaster and said, hey guys, let's do this, right? They would have been like, no, that's crazy. We had to show that it worked. We had to have years go by of it working, and then Ticketmaster's like, hey, that's a great idea, let's adopt that. But in the meantime, Ticketmaster wasn't in a position to slow us down, but in the meantime, they didn't get in our way, and that's the most important thing. So, now, that's not to say that there might not be specific projects at Sony that maybe could be looking at blockchain, could be solving their own problems with blockchain. Certainly, we've talked to Intel a lot. Intel's always looking for coming up with new kinds of software that work better on their computers than other people's computers. So Intel has been talking to us. So, but of course, there's huge parts of Intel that don't care about what we're doing. So, unfortunately, I don't know enough about the internals of Sony, and certainly not the part of Sony that you work for. But just to give one really concrete example would be to not have a rule saying that NFTs aren't allowed in PlayStation games. Right? Do they have to push it? Do they have to force, try and force NFTs on people? No, please don't. But can they keep from blocking it? Yes, please.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Oh, do you have a question, or are you just stopping me?
For now, we have networking time.
That's
So
networking
yeah, and we have sushis a lot. Yeah. So why don't we move on to networking time?
Very much so.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Of course. Thank you, everyone. That was fun.